Hello and welcome to our final video of our memory unit. Today we're going to focus on forgetting, why we forget, how we forget, and how our memory is maybe not as reliable as we originally thought. So let's take a look at the different reasons why we can't remember. The number one reason our memory probably fails us is because the information never got into our long-term memory to begin with. We refer to that as encoding failures. If the information never gets in, we can never pull it back out again. One of the reasons we might fail to encode information has to do with interference, of other information getting in the way of us being able to encode the information that we want to. And this can happen in a variety of ways. One way is known as proactive interference. And proactive interference is when old information that we've learned gets in the way of us remembering new information that is presented. If you think about it, let's say you take 2 classes in a row, and the first class you learn some really important information. Maybe you're spending a lot of time paying attention to that information. Maybe you have a test coming up on that information, and so you spend more time focused and thinking about that information, and that continues on when you go to your next class. You're exposed to some new information in your second class. By the time you get home at the end of the day, the only thing you can remember is the information you learned in that first class, and that would be called proactive interference. For me, sometimes this happens as a teacher when it comes to learning students' names. I've learned a lot of names over the course of several years, and every year I'm presented with new names to learn. Every once in a while, I might make a mistake and call a student by an old student's name. Maybe one that's sitting in the same seat where that student used to, or maybe it's a sibling who looks similar to their older sibling who I've had in class before. When that happens, proactive interference is the reason why it's more difficult to encode or remember the new name that I've now been presented with. Sometimes it happens in the opposite order, where we experience what's known as retroactive interference. And retroactive interference is when new information gets in the way of old information. So instead of remembering that first class period's information you were presented with, perhaps the second class was deemed more important in your mind. You paid more attention to that information, and at the end of the day, you can only remember the last thing that you learned. When that happens, you're experiencing retroactive interference. That would be like me seeing a student from, say, my first year of teaching and not being able to remember their name anymore. I've been presented with so many new names since that point in time that now that new information is blocking the retrieval of that old information, and I can no longer remember it. So sometimes we experience proactive interference, sometimes we experience retroactive interference. It all kind of just depends on a variety of circumstantial factors that are going to influence what we encode and what we do not. Sometimes our forgetting is more permanent than just interference. Amnesia is the type of forgetting where we have the inability to form memories in a permanent capacity, or maybe a semi-permanent capacity. Sometimes this happens due to a trauma or some type of injury to our brain. So an accident, for example, might cause us to experience amnesia. When this happens, we might experience either retrograde or anterograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is when we can't remember the past. So say we did have some type of accident where we fell and hit our head, and all of a sudden, we can't remember anything from before that event. So all of our past memories are now forgotten, or maybe some of our past memories are now forgotten, but from that point on, we can still form new memories each day since we fell and hit our head. Sometimes the opposite happens, and that's known as anterograde amnesia. So we have all of our memories from the past, but say from that point on, from that day we hit our head, we can no longer form new memories. And we wake up each morning thinking that it's that same day when that happened. If we can't form new memories, that's referred to as anterograde amnesia. Sometimes that amnesia doesn't happen because of an injury. It can also happen because of vitamin deficiency, because we need those vitamins for our brain to function properly and help us in storing memories. Korsakoff syndrome is the name for the disease that prevents us from encoding information into our memory because of a vitamin deficiency. This can happen in both retrograde and anterograde amnesia, and it's usually a result of either severe malnutrition that prevents us from getting the vitamins we need, or alcohol abuse, which blocks the absorption of the vitamins that we need in order to encode information into our memories. So those are ways that we actually forget information that we're presented with. But sometimes we're really confident about what we remember, and we're confident that our memories are correct, and then we later find out that we're actually wrong. And why does that happen? Why do we sometimes make mistakes in believing something that isn't actually true? And our memories can actually change over time, and that's probably one of the most important things to remember when it comes to our memories. Some of the ways that our memories change over time are known as leveling, sharpening, and assimilating. So when we are reflecting back on an event, sometimes information we deem to be important, and some information we deem to be not as important. And so sometimes information gets dropped from our memory if we didn't think it was important to pay attention to and encode. And that is known as leveling. Sometimes we simplify details, and so things get left out. Other pieces of information we think are very important to our memory, and so we focus on them, and perhaps we even highlight or overemphasize them, and that is known as sharpening. So that can change our memory of an event, because now we think certain details are actually more important to us than they were when they actually happened. And when two people sharpen different parts of their memory, they might remember the same event a little bit differently. And then sometimes information gets changed, and we refer to that as assimilating. So sometimes information doesn't fit our schema for what an event should have been like, and so as a result, that memory gets changed to fit into what most likely happened, or what we would have expected to happen instead of what actually happened. There are a few other ways that our memory can change as well. Misinformation effect looks at the outside factors that can influence how we remember certain events. The misinformation effect takes place when, say, another person's version of the events or the way a person asks questions about the event change the way that we remember it ourselves. So again, say two people are remembering the same event and telling a story about it, and the second person adds in details that are not actually true. You might actually visualize those events that they are mentioning and believe that those actually happened, and they become incorporated into your own memory. Or sometimes the questions that are asked can change the way that you see a memory in your mind's eye. For example, let's say you were a witness to a car accident, and someone asks you afterwards, what direction were the cars going when they bumped into each other? That's going to create a different memory in your mind than if they asked, what direction were the cars going when they smashed into each other? So the language and the wording of those questions can cause you to reimagine the event in your mind's eye and remember the event differently. And that is the misinformation effect. Sometimes we change memories ourselves, and that's known as the imagination effect. And the imagination effect is when we actually imagine events happening, and then we start to believe that they actually took place. An example of this could be, say you get into an argument with a friend, and maybe some of you have experienced this before, where you leave that argument and you start thinking about all of the things you wish you said, the comebacks that you think of after the argument is over, and the zingers that you wish you were able to place into conversation. And then when you go to tell, say, another friend or a family member about the argument you just had, you start to drop those comebacks and zingers into the retelling of the story even though they didn't actually happen. And if you do this and actually begin to believe that that's how the conversation went down, that is known as the imagination effect. Some final ways that our memories can change also include source amnesia. And source amnesia is when we forget where we initially heard or saw something. This could happen when, say, we read something in a book but thought that we saw it in a movie, or when we dreamt about something and we actually believe it actually happened in our waking life. This could have some more serious ramifications if, say, a singer writes a lyric that they think they came up with on their own and think it's absolutely fantastic, but turns out they actually read it in a poem a long time ago and they didn't create it on their own. Now they might have accidentally plagiarized another person's work, and that could have some serious consequences. And the last way that our memories change is what's known as memory construction or memory reconstruction. And this is the idea that we actually rebuild our memories every time we reflect on them. Our memories are not perfect episodes that we can just rewind and play back in our heads. Every time we remember an event, our memory, our mind has to rebuild it. And because if we go all the way back to the beginning of this unit, we don't actually encode all information around us, all that sensory information that ends up getting dropped, means there's going to be gaps in our memory. But our brain does this fantastic thing where it fills in those missing pieces with our schema, with what we think should have or most likely would have happened. And so say I ask you to remember the last time you went to an Italian restaurant, and you close your eyes and you imagine what that looks like. You may not have actually encoded all of the details of what that restaurant looked like, but because you've been to an Italian restaurant before and you have a schema for it, your brain might fill in those gaps so that the memory looks and appears seamless. So perhaps the tablecloths were white, but you imagine a red and white checkered tablecloth. And perhaps the walls were plain brown or orange colors, but you remember them with some intricate paintings along the border. Those small details are coming from your schema. They're changing the way you remember the event. Sometimes these can be small details, but sometimes when you rebuild the memory, you might actually remember big details that have changed. People's faces, who were there, conversations that were had, all of that can be influenced by memory reconstruction. And so our memories are not perfect, and they're going to fail us from time to time. So we've reached the end of this unit, and by now we've looked at the entire memory process from how we encode information, tips to increase the information that we move into our long-term memory, things that we can do to help facilitate retrieval, and some things to consider when it comes to how our memory can fail us. Our memories are not perfect, but the more we use this information in our day-to-day lives, the more we can improve upon our memory in ways that really matter, in meeting people and remembering their names, in studying for assessments in school, in giving a presentation for a business project one day. Hopefully you can use the information from this memory chapter as you go off into other areas of study and as we go throughout this course. Our memory is such a fantastic piece of what makes us who we are. Our experiences and the things that we remember about our lives help to shape our identity and help to shape our understanding of the world around us. So I hope this memory unit was helpful to you, even if our memories aren't perfect. It's such a fantastic area of psychological study. Thanks for watching, and of course remember, be kind to your mind.